They always told them to go get volunteers, and they get real fast.
You know, sometimes the volunteer jobs are a lot better than the other.
Well, guy told me when I was going into boot camp, he says, whatever you do not raise your hand and volunteer for anything. He says, because if you do, you'll be sorry.
Yeah.
So I never volunteered for nothing.
And was this Marines?
Yeah.
Okay.
I hear the sound of Tony's voice.
Yeah.
We all gonna get educated today.
That's right.
I told my mother I was gonna get educated and I was gonna become a high school graduate.
That's hard to get out of your mouth. I can hardly say it the correct way.
Told the teacher told me I was smart enough I could get an epidemic scholarship.
You just have to put the emphasis on the right syllable.
I didn't like school. I didn't realize until after I got out of school, there's things I wanted to do, and I realized I couldn't do none of them until I got a high school education. So I ended up going back to school, and I didn't graduate until 1982.
Oh, my.
It was almost 10 years.
Well, but sometimes it takes that long to realize your dream or get what degree or diploma you want.
Well, I was kind of hard-headed.
Something similar happened with me in college.
Really?
Yeah, I did the traditional 4 years in college, but I switched programs a bunch of times in those first 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got to the end, and my advisor never said, okay, switching programs is going to mean that you need to pick up certain classes.
Well, yeah.
He was just like, oh yeah, let's do that one, you know?
Oh, my
And
goodness.
so when I got into the when I got close to the 4 years, he was like, well, you're gonna have to do an extra year. And I was like, I'm not signing up for that. And so after 4 years, I went ahead and left to go. I ended up doing a couple church plants, like leading worship for those, and then went back to finish up when I was 27. So,
Well, unfortunately, there were not online courses yet.
Mhm.
And that
Right.
would have really helped you immensely.
right. Oh yeah.
You could have said goodbye, and finished up online.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, our kids nowadays
Trying
have it so much nicer as far as the online options during the summer to pick up an extra course here or there
Mm-hmm.
and still work during the summer. And it's just,
Or they can take a class over.
oh yeah, you can improve your grade. What we got was what we got stuck with. I still have a D in econ the first semester.
I was forced you got B.
Yeah, as if that improved my grades. I had double the work because I was writing your papers or revising them heavily. You would write them, but I rewrote them.
I wrote farm
How you doing?
rather than city.
Yeah, you wrote in farm style, not city style. That's true.
I could leave this class.
We might need
I
somebody to step
did
in.
learn something in school.
Mhm.
Well, you're all not going to mind, so lay your heads on your tables, and we're going to keep our heads down until class is over. See, I learned something.
I'd say, goodness.
Hey,
Oh, be quiet. Here he is.
I can get in.
Good morning.
Our website to
Wait.
change the
Do you ever remember
for BDCC.
when you were if you went to college, that sometimes if you had a professor and he was late,
By 5 minutes.
well, in ours, I think it was 15 minutes.
Oh, okay.
We had to wait 15 minutes. If it was a graduate assistant, it was 10 minutes. And then if it was somebody lower than that, it was 5 minutes. So you can just put whatever level you think I'm at, and then if I'm not here, go.
No.
Well, I was going to instruct the class. I had it all down bad.
Okay, yeah, and that's good
Have
too.
everybody put their heads down. That's the classes I like the best.
Let's see. Okay. So how is everyone?
We're fine.
Phenomenal.
Phenomenal? That's even better, gosh.
Yeah, that's a real good answer.
Yes.
I don't have big words.
Well, I don't think I could spell it at this time of day.
Yeah.
My sister was always so proud because she could spell. I can't even say it. Anti-establishment.
Ontarianism. Very
She
good.
could spell it.
Oh my,
Uh,
that is accomplishment.
yeah.
I just figure on a scale from 1 to 10, good is in the like 4 to 6 range. So, like if I were in school, good is failing. So,
Uh-huh. So that's why you're phenomenal. Okay.
very least great. That's at least a 7.
If you arrive at some place exactly on time, when it's like, say, be there at 7, you walk in at 7, you're late.
Okay, we're going to continue. Sorry to those at home that we are running behind. That's my fault. I remembered when I almost walked in the room that the chair that I sit on, I had used for Sunday or thought I might use for Sunday, and it was still sitting on the platform in the worship center. So I had to go back and get it and get here. Okay, we are in chapter 7. We just got about through verse 11, I believe. And so up to this point in chapter 7, what have we learned about marriage? You might have to do a quick scan verses, chapter 7, verses 1 through 11. At this point, Paul is addressing this question of marriage, and we talked about some different things about what was happening, at least from the Corinthians' viewpoint, and Paul is addressing, trying to set things straight. And so, do you remember any of that we talked about? You're not going to hurt my feelings if you don't. I used to be, if I would ever preach and then I would come back the next week and somebody would ask me something about what I said the week before. And you know what? I didn't always even remember. And I thought, I used to be like, well, why don't you guys remember week to week? And I thought, hey, you're the one that was up there talking and you don't remember. So it's, so apparently the Corinthians were dealing with a question, and it was more an esoteric kind of question. It was more of a, I wouldn't say even philosophical, that's not the correct word, but they were, it seems like they were abstaining from having sexual relations with their spouses for more, I guess I would call, like, new age ideas or whatever. That's not the term. Esoteric, I don't even know if I know the definition of that word, but it's, it wasn't because of good things. It wasn't because they were fasting. It wasn't because they were doing other things in order. That's why they had refrained from having sexual relations with their spouse. They thought it was a good thing. And Paul is saying, no, it's not. And the only time that it is, if it's agreeable on both sides of the issue for the wife and the husband. And then, even then, if you step away from that physical relationship with your spouse, how long is that? Do you remember? There is no number. What were you saying, Diana?
Probably what they agreed upon.
Very good. Yes, exactly right. It was what they agreed upon, but Paul gives warning, but it shouldn't be long. So, so the Corinthians are asking the questions, but it isn't for like great reasons. And so he is trying to straighten that whole thing out about, and reminding them they are subject to the authority of the Lord. And then in this whole idea of us being givers, within our relationships, that's covered as well. in my case, my body is not mine, it's Sandy's, hers is not hers, it's mine, so to speak. Not so to speak, that's what he says. But the whole idea of us having authority, is what he kind of talks about there. So anyway, so he's trying to clear this up for this teaching apparently that's happening at the church at Corinth. And what I think is also interesting as we look at chapter 7, as Paul talks about marriage, and then we're going to get into, maybe later on marriage and divorce, Paul quotes Jesus and he says, "Not I, but the Lord." He refers back to what Jesus says in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John about marriage and divorce. We have that situation when the Pharisees come to Jesus, and of course, they're setting him up. They're asking a question they already know the answer to. It's a rhetorical one almost. And they ask Jesus about, hey, can we get divorced? And Jesus says to them, and then they answer the question, well, Abraham said we could. And Jesus says that was not always the intent. That was never the intention. The only reason you do is because you are stubborn. You are hard-hearted. And that's the only reason why Abraham allows it. But that was never to be the case. And as we go through chapter 7 here, Paul certainly reiterates that getting a divorce should be the very last thing that should happen. Except for, I would say, in cases of abuse, that has to be taken in consideration. And I think Paul would agree with that. But in other cases, you shouldn't. And if you do, then there's some stipulations what you do afterwards. So, okay. So that's kind of where we're at. Someone read verses 12 and 13. Barb, you want to do that?
Sure. Now I will speak to the rest of you, though I do not have a direct command from the Lord. If a Christian man has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to continue living with him, he must not leave her. And if a Christian woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him.
Okay. What one of the when I was preparing and studying for this, one of the things I thought was interesting that actually two of the guys that I read pretty thoroughly when I get ready for our time here, both of them highlighted the fact that first of all, it says what Barb read that the wife shouldn't do shouldn't do this, or a husband shouldn't do that. That the idea is that even the wife was included in this, because in that culture they didn't actually rate. But here Paul changes all that, and he says, this is how you should behave, or what happens as a man, but also this is also for the woman. Whereas they're probably writing in their day, she wouldn't even be considered. And that was just kind of the law of the land for those folks. So he addresses that, and but he wants, and who, why is the possibility that they are separating? What's the condition here?
A believer or non-believer.
Yeah, it's that whole thing, Ken.
The thing about it is that in reading this whole thing, I think the assumption has to be that they were both unbelievers when they were married. And therefore, and one had accepted Christ and the other hadn't. Because Scripture also tells us that you shouldn't be unequally yoked. And so you really have to make the assumption when he says this, that in the beginning they were equally yoked because neither one were believers.
Yes. And that very same thing, that whole thing of being unequally yoked is also addressed by a sentence or two within this chapter. Yeah, I think that's great insight, Ken, and certainly that probably was the case. And things have changed. One person has said, I want to follow Christ and whatever. And so, what is that? And so that raises the questions, or at least the Corinthians raised the question. So what does that mean for this relationship? Should it also be changing? And, one of the things that we said, I think last week about Paul's situation, was Paul married? Was he ever married? Is he widowed? There was that question. And what if Paul's situation was, as Ken said, Paul's a persecutor. He's married to, this woman who's very much in line with what he's doing. And then he becomes a follower because Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus. And now he has this huge life change and he begins following Christ. And so maybe the speculation is, if he was married and that was the situation, she left. We don't know that. That's just,
Speculation.
yeah, it's just speculation. Because other writers will say, I just don't think he was married at all, that kind of thing. And they may be right. We don't know. But here they're trying to figure out, how's this relationship going to go forward? And
So doesn't it say that in 14, how the relationship should move? I mean, they're sanctified.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that. There's one other thing I wanted to say here and you're fine. You're fine, Diane. Yeah, you've been gone for 2 weeks, so you just wait your turn, okay? And when I'm ready to call on you, I will, that kind of deal. So it says, now I will speak to the rest of you. So what he has said before, okay, we've put that to bed. Now listen, this is now what I need to say to the rest of you folks. And he also says, I do not have a direct command from the Lord. In other words, Jesus did not address these kinds of issues. Well, put this way, if he did, we don't have it recorded in the Gospels. So Paul says, I'm not getting a direct command from the Lord, but I think also with his level of being an apostle and such, and what he knows has been said before, marriage is a sacred thing. And so he is upholding that. But then, he deals with this situation if one's a believer, one's not. So I don't have a direct command from the Lord, but if a fellow believer has a wife who's not a believer, and she's willing to continue living with him, he must not leave her. And if a believing woman has a husband who's not a believer, he is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him. We almost get the impression that maybe some of the Corinthians said, now I'm a follower of Christ and stuff, and maybe unspoken or spoken, and I do want to leave her. I want to start anew because of this, and I want to, all those things in the past, I want to move past. And so I think, Paul is, later he says, whatever state that you find yourself in, married or unmarried, stay there. And that is what he is hoping will happen here. Okay, and then now verse 14, what Diana was talking about, for the believing wife brings holiness to her marriage, be holy, but now they are holy. Ask us, what does he mean? Okay, I'm going to get to that. Something that I found out as I was preparing and studying this, and I didn't know this. Well, there's a lot of things I don't know, but this was one more. One of the complaints in that day and age about Christianity was that when a person became a Christian, maybe it was just one, maybe the husband, maybe the wife, whatever, that it was splitting up families, because that's what was happening. People were leaving spouses, even maybe they wanted to stay together or whatever, and whoever was the new believer in Christ says, no, I don't want to be involved in this. And so one of the knocks against Christianity was, well, let me read this to you. It says this, and I don't even know who said this, I could find it out, but it says, one of the great heathen complaints, okay, heathens means they're not on our side. One of the great heathen complaints against Christianity was exactly the complaint that Christianity did break up families, and listen to this, and was a disruptive influence in society. And then it goes on to say, tampering with the domestic relationships was in fact one of the first charges brought against the Christians. So apparently, what Paul is addressing here with the Corinthians, maybe that's being repeated in other places around Asia Minor and stuff. And basically those who are outside looking in at, hey, you're a Christian, whatever, you're just blowing up things by choosing to follow. Are you wanting to say something? You look like it.
Well,
You have that look.
I always have that.
You always have that look.
I was born that way.
You were born that way.
But anyway, if they consent to live with each other, it says that's okay.
Mhm.
But I think everyone in here knows when a spouse accepts Christ and the other one doesn't, that occasionally they'll be browbeaten.
To come alongside with the
Yeah.
new
And perfect example is our oldest son, and his wife almost got divorced. She was a believer, but of the Methodist faith,
okay.
and he was a Christian,
Uh-huh.
and he kept harping on her that she needed to get baptized.
Mm-hmm.
And it caused some real friction in the early marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what verse 14, we need to kind of explore what that means here. One other thing, one person I was reading said, this situation, one spouse is a believer, one is not, and there's this whole idea of maybe we should split, we should start anew or whatever because of our differences in faith and no faith. And one author makes this comment, or he has this insight. He said, partly by what Paul is saying here is, marriage was such an important thing that it should not be dissolved, almost for no reason, except we talked about abuse or whatever. And he said, what does that show the world if even if you as a believer cannot reconcile with your spouse? What does that say to the world, your example about them reconciling with Christ? Your own actions or lack of, pretty much tears down your whole argument about reconciliation. And so I thought that was interesting that, he sees that or whatever. Okay, what is this sanctified stuff? What are your thoughts there?
What is that stuff?
Yeah, what is the sanctification thing that he's saying here, and holiness, and what do you think?
Sanctified, to me, it means saved.
Okay, it's a part of the salvation process.
Yeah.
I think technically, at least I remember when I was going through college and stuff, sanctified meant to set apart, to set apart for a special purpose. And in this, what Paul is saying, at least I think what he's saying, for the believing wife brings holiness to her marriage. Okay, she's the believer. She brings holiness to her marriage, and the believing husband brings holiness to his marriage. And then it goes on to address the children. Otherwise, your children would not be holy, but now they are holy. Particularly, Ken, earlier, you were saying a husband and wife, this whole thing was when they started life together, they were equally yoked. They weren't following any kind of faith tradition whatsoever. And now one is. And then the question that happens in most families is, how are we going to raise the kids? in what direction should we be heading with them? And I've had friends who like they're believers. Your illustration was your daughter-in-law grew up in the faith tradition as a Methodist. I've had friends who, they're a Christian, but their spouse is Catholic. And the Catholic faith has some very strong opinions about how that should happen. And so you have to come to an agreement. What are we going to do? And, but it is saying here, I think what it's saying is that they have more opportunity to see what it is to be a Christian and an openness to maybe come to know Christ because you remain together, because that's how you hopefully are living it out in that relationship. And you're going to have a better shot of winning your spouse, staying in that relationship, reconciling and keep following the Lord and doing all that you can, rather than you two separating and then you not have that influence. Okay, Carolyn.
But that puts the one that's the believer has almost a burden, because that man or husband or wife has to, I don't want to say be perfect, it's that, but because they're the example to the spouse, and the spouse can always come back and say, "You're a Christian?
Yeah.
And you've talked about your neighbors?"
Yes. Yeah, because we've all had that with people who know we are followers of Christ. And then when we do something outside our faith, or at least, saying this or that or whatever, because we've all had somebody saying, "You call yourself a Christian." Yeah. I can, what were you going to say, Diana? You're allowed to speak now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Actually, it takes much faith I've been in that situation.
Okay, you've lived it.
Yes, I've lived it. And being a Christian, I assumed that I didn't know my other spouse's heart, so I couldn't make judgment of where his standing is. I was just had faith that God would work, and He did. See, so
yeah. I think, and what Paul is saying here, by staying in that relationship and hopefully by living the example of this, by you are not saving them.
right.
Only Jesus does that. But you are providing, hopefully, in an environment where that hopefully that they can see Christ in you and say, I appreciate that, by, and by how maybe you respond to each other, and you're giving and you're loving and you going overboard, because and I've shared this, and Sandy would be okay with me sharing this. Our marriage very much improved when I finally got the idea that it wasn't all about me. And I would like to say I really came to this conclusion about 25 years ago, but it was really only about 5. And, it was just by how I acted, small things. Okay, well, let's watch TV tonight. Well, let's watch what I want to watch. Or, we could either go here or go out there out to eat. And I know she likes there, but I don't like it, so we go here. It was just small things, but it even could get to big things. And when I finally decided, when those thoughts sprang into my mind about, I want to go here, or I want to watch that, or I want to do this, God started putting in my mind, Tony, it's not all about you. And my behavior began to change. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, because it ain't, but we have less arguments and discord now because I'm working on that. Now, I'm not saying that for you to pat me on the back. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying,
Gotcha.
Hopefully people, this unbelieving spouse will see this difference in you and recognize it isn't all about you. And they say, hey, maybe this is something I should consider. And so that's part of the reason why Paul says you need to remain together. But this whole thing about children, it extends to them too. Again, by you being a Christian alone, that doesn't save them. Only Jesus does that, but it brings them to a point that there's the possibility. Yes, ma'am, Diana.
Thank you, I can talk. I want to finish the story.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Just that we had a child. And the progression was I was saved first, then she was saved. And then she was so convicted about her daddy not being saved, she said to him and was crying,
Oh,
Daddy, you are not going to go to heaven with us.
wow.
And he got to work.
You know, kids sometimes are able to break those barriers more so than anybody else because the genuineness of your daughter's heart and just, you know, it's just, yeah, because gosh, yes. And so kids are just wonderful in that regard. That's why we try to have we do. We have a very strong children's ministry here because sometimes it is they who lead their families here. Something, an insight that, and this was from I was telling you last week about Dr. Tom Constable out of Plano. This is from his notes, and he takes this from somebody, I don't know who it was, but he says they makes this observation. He said, observe the large and liberal view, and I'm not talking political stuff here, okay? But it says, observe the large and liberal view which the apostle here adopts. Okay, he's wanting to see what Paul is doing here, and what might even, you know, doesn't seem like, wow, I didn't catch that. The lesser takes its character from the greater. Now, who's the lesser here in this scenario, believer, unbeliever? The unbeliever. Okay, right. So the lesser takes its character from the greater, not the greater, the believer, from the lesser. You know, I just thought that was interesting. And he goes on to say, God does not reject the better because of its alliance with the worse. I question, I well know that I would have used that word. But God does not reject the better because of its alliance with the worse, this marriage of unequally yoked, but accepts the worse on the account of its alliance with the better. In other words, the possibilities that can happen that they remain together. Hopefully they see an example of Christ being displayed by the spouse who is a believer. And so that was the whole thing. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now we are verse 15? Okay, verse 15. But if the husband or the wife who isn't a believer insists on leaving, let them go. In such cases, the believing husband or wife is no longer bound to the other, for God has called you to live in peace. And that was all it was like all parentheses in my Bible. It was like it was an afterthought. But so why does Paul say it's okay for the unbelieving person who says, I just don't want to be here, I don't want to be in this relationship, I can't deal with this, and he says let him go? And what is the main reason why he says let him go? Kim.
Well, when you think about it, if the yeast is bad, it causes the rest of the yeast to be bad. If you have a good part of the yeast is good, but the bad can influence the good,
Yeah.
make it bad. And, you know, people that are unequally yoked when they get married, if one is a believer and one is not, the non-believer has a bigger influence, can have a bigger influence on the believer.
Yeah, it's just like the opposite side of the the opposite side of the coin, where, you know, Paul wants them to remain together, hopefully that by them seeing the influence of the believer living out faith in the way that it should, that it would have an effect on that. But oftentimes, as you're saying, it can be the reverse, and maybe the unbeliever pulls that other believer away from their faith. And I've seen that happen too. With, they get married, and this, one of the spouses was very involved with their faith, very connected, growing, and then over in time, they are drawn away, by weekend boating or whatever it is, and, they get their time in doing. So it's a good point. I mean, same argument Paul gives about staying together can also be the other way. Yeah, excellent. Okay, but back to my original question. Why is it Paul says it's okay to let the unbelieving spouse leave? Why? Or, why does he say it's okay because of what? What's it's in the very last verse, or the very last portion of that verse.
God's called you to live in peace.
Yeah. The Lord wants peaceful relationships. He wants peace. And if this situation for the unbeliever is just creating more havoc, more pain, there's no civility happening with. And he said it's almost like he was saying, and for the sake of peace, just let him go. And I don't know if you've heard that or seen that in relationships. Did you have something?
Yeah, as he's describing this opportunity for an unbelieving spouse to be made holy through the relationship to the believing spouse, if there's hostility from that unbeliever, then the chance of that relationship bringing holiness is removed, right? And then there's not the peace. It's like, you can't.
Yeah.
To oversimplify, you'd say you can make a horse to water, but you can't make a drink.
Yeah.
It's an oversimplification, but it's kind of the same principle.
Yes. But what's also interesting, he says it's okay to let the unbelieving spouse leave, whoever, man or woman, but the believer does not have that option.
Right.
Again, protecting the sanctity of that marriage. That marriage bond, how important it is. You don't have this choice. But if it's causing all this havoc and heartache and pain, and let him go, because there should be peace. So he's dealing with that happening there. Go on now. Let's 16. Don't you wives realize that your husbands might be saved because of you? And don't you husbands, again, it's that same argument. And don't you husbands realize that your wives might be saved because of you? Again, just reinforcing why he wants them to hang in there. And maybe, again, he's addressing those Corinthians who say, well, I'm a believer and she doesn't want to split up, but I do. And basically Paul says, no, you can't. You can't. And why, by what he's saying there in that verse is, don't you realize that the power of that, what could happen in that relationship?
And just said that believers are held to a higher standard of love and acceptance.
Okay, who said that?
And
okay. Yes, we as believers, Ann is very correct. We are held to a higher standard. We shouldn't be brought down or made equal with that who knows nothing of Christ. It shouldn't be this way. It should hopefully be the other way. Again, that hope and desire. Carolyn.
This is with notes. Well,
that's okay.
Notes. Anyway, it's one they often use for youth groups, but where it ends, the verse, God has called you to peace. Now, this reads a little different. For you, wife, how do you know whether you will save your husband? And then the same thing. Are you, husband, how do you know you will save your wife. Now, granted, I put an inflection there,
Mhm.
like, how do you know that? And
I have a story
maybe
for that. Okay, go
a
ahead.
person is so, like, the peace. And it's like, I'm never gonna save this man. Or you don't save.
Right, we
that,
know
but
what you
how
mean.
I'm
Yeah,
using
yeah,
it.
yes.
Or the husband might say, it's constant turmoil here, and I'm never gonna lead her to Christ.
Mhm.
But I think that goes with then leave.
Mhm. Okay, so you're saying what then?
Oh.
You are saying they should be able to leave, or you're talking about the unbelieving person
Well,
or the believer?
yeah. Well, it's like, why stay there in turmoil?
Right. The overriding thing is still peace.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Because you say, but I'm staying because I think I can help save my husband.
Yeah.
How do you know you're going to save your husband?
But I think I would make a difference here. He's saying that the unbeliever has that choice to leave, but if you're the believer, you don't have that choice to leave, even if that situation as you described it is there.
Uh-huh.
And that's what.
I think there's a little bit of a gray area though, because I do know, like in other places in Scripture, it says, if your spouse is unfaithful,
Certainly.
right?
Yes.
And so it does, like, these aren't like, there's not just one scenario of an unbeliever and a believer being married, right? And if that, unfaithfulness also has, I think, multiple facets, right? You can be unfaithful in the way that, like in physical abuse. You can be unfaithful in verbal and emotional abuse. You can be unfaithful in, sexual immorality. Like, there's unfaithfulness on multiple levels, right? And so it's, I don't think it's necessarily simple and cut and dried. You definitely need to be led by the Spirit in these things, and also with wise counsel from other believers.
Certainly, definitely.
But if that spouse is if the unbelieving spouse is a faithful spouse who wants to stay in the relationship with a believer, right? I think those are the things I'm reading into this scenario, right? If you've got an unbelieving spouse who's faithful and wants to stay in the union of marriage, then stay there. Stay there and love them and try to lead them by the way you live and love, to a saving belief in Christ, right? But, there's scenarios that kind of blow that out of the water.
I think in this, and maybe it's a little bit different take what Ben is saying, or maybe not. I think what Paul is still doing, he is raising the level of what marriage is, and we can't let some of these, we need to work at it.
Mhm.
And it's at a high level, and we can't be, and by no means by what Ben said or Carolyn, what you said, or, it's let go for frivolous reasons. I'm not saying that, but it's just that how highly Jesus held what marriage was and how Paul is reinforcing it here. But there are those instances, unfaithfulness beyond maybe even the physical portion, abuse or whatever. If even some of the commentators I read say, if there is a danger of a person getting, hurt, they shouldn't be there. That kind of a thing. Okay, verse 17 on through 19, it says, each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you and remain as you were when God first called you. Okay, this harkens back to, should I marry, should I not marry? And Paul says his desire would be, if you're not married, don't get married. And that's kind of the path he is following. But he's not saying he's not saying, this is a direct command from the Lord and this is how you should do it. He's not saying that. But he says, my opinion is if you're unmarried, stay unmarried. If you're married, and like he's saying here, stay married. And so he's just covering all the bases. Whatever situation the Lord has placed you, stay there. And then it goes on, verse 18. For instance, a man who was circumcised, now he's using some illustrations here. For instance, a man who was circumcised before he became a believer should not try to reverse it. So in other words, you are a card-carrying conservative Jew, you're a fellow, you've been circumcised, and now you come to Christ. Paul's not saying you need to reverse what has been happened there that delineates and says that you are Jewish. I have heard, that some, fellas have gone to that reversal thing to try to show that they weren't, and how painful that must have been. But so he's using a thing that's very common in that day, Jews coming to know Jesus in his day. So don't, you should not try to reverse it. And the man who was uncircumcised when he became a believer should not be circumcised now. I don't understand that argument. I don't know why they would, but who knows? And then he goes on, and this is the important part, for it makes no difference whether or not a man has been circumcised. The important thing is to keep God's commandments, to obey. Were you going to say something there?
Well, in the early church, some of the leaders said that men had to be circumcised.
Book of
When they
Galatians,
accepted Christ.
Ephesians. Mhm. Yeah. They were marrying what they, the top things they enjoyed about their Jewish faith, and they were trying to marry some of those things within the faith of following Christ. And Paul was saying, you don't need to have circumcision a part of this or whatever. You just need to follow Jesus. But that was some of the false teaching that was springing up in the church. And I think particularly it was in Galatia that kind of started.
This Jesus plus.
Yeah, very good. I like that. Jesus plus, have Jesus. We all agree on that. Plus, and whatever the plus is whatever you think should be a part of that. And so in that day, for those good Jews, plus was circumcision, or plus was, the question that we'll address in chapter 8. The plus was the food you eat or not eat. I think sometimes we even do that. Maybe out of our opinion about something, and say, yes, it's Jesus plus you need to stop doing this, or it's Jesus and, don't do that, whatever. Yeah, that's off the hip.
Let's make that list.
Yes. So verse 20, yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. Again, just reiterating, this is probably like the third time now he's saying something like this. Yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. Now, and this is a tough one, what he's saying next here. Verse 21, are you a slave? Now, we have to also understand, because when you and I read slave, our mind goes back to what slavery was here. And we would all agree it was not good by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, there might have been some owners of slaves who treated them well, and we would applaud that when that happened in that day. But we cannot put a template of what a slave was in his day to what we know as our history, because it could have been a little different practice from what we see. Now, I still think it was not always good either. So I'm not, by no means am I trying to defend slavery. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not, please don't leave here and say, well, Tony's all for it, because that's not the case. Okay. Because if you do, I'm just saying you don't know what you're talking about. But verse 21, are you a slave? And this is what's so, it's surprising. Don't let that worry you. I mean, how would it, if that was your station in life, and then Paul comes on and says, don't let that worry you. I mean, how would that hit you?
I'd probably say, yeah, Paul, when were you ever a slave?
I would probably stop listening to him.
Yes, I mean, but you know, he does say something else after this that we have to pay attention to. But you're right. It's like when he first says it's like it's a slap in the face. Don't let that worry you. But if you get a chance to be free, take it. Because there were opportunities where that happened. Isn't there some indication when we look through scripture and stuff where slaves bought their freedom, or they got to a point maybe they were an indentured servant for a while, but they eventually worked that off. And so, Paul is saying, he's not saying that this whole argument, whatever state that you find yourself in, stay there. He's not saying that here. If you're a slave and you have an opportunity to move out of that, do so. But I think he's also saying, but if you don't, he says, don't worry about it. And this is the case where faith, I think, comes in, and that you trust God for wherever you're at in your state of where life has taken you. I had a meeting yesterday with a gentleman about just some things in his life with his family and raising his boys, and they're in college now, and coming to the realization as his boys were entering college that he and his wife, they didn't have the money to pay for it, and he said, part of me felt like in order to make this happen, what I'm doing in my area of ministry, I thought I've got to quit this. And I've got to go out and find a job in the secular world in order to meet these demands, the financial demands that now is placed on our household because our two boys are going off to college. And he and his wife got together and they talked long and hard. I mean, they really considered this. And he says, and we came to the conclusion, we've always said that God has always remained faithful to us. We don't know how this is going to work out, but we're going to trust him. And in the story that he shares, which is so cool, one of his boys gets a scholarship to play soccer at a school, and his high school coach had been an assistant coach at the college level at this school that was where he had gone to school to coach. And he told the dad when the son got the scholarship to go to that school, he says, I know for a fact that is the largest scholarship they've ever given a soccer player in all the times that they've had the program. And he said, and over the time, he says, my son now is actually making money by making that choice. He said, that's not something he says, God is the one who did that.
Yeah.
And so in this area of this person being a slave or whoever, just, maybe you don't get that point where you get that freedom, but you remain in Christ and he will be faithful. I think that's what's being said underneath some of this wording here.
Tony,
Yes.
this applies and it doesn't apply, but if you don't mind, I'll tell the story and I will.
Yes, you will. Keep it brief, lady. Keep it brief.
Okay. I was 7 years getting through 4 years of college.
I did it in 5.
Yeah, well,
4.
wasn't
I'm just
great.
joking. Yeah.
It was work, go back, work,
Earn the money.
earn the money, work at night, or go take night classes and so on. And I got through 7 years later. Okay. Then in my second year, the best principal out of 8 that I ever had.
Oh, wow.
And he said to me one day, he said, Lily's, the foundation is giving
Yes.
money.
Grants.
And he said something about, what are you going to do your graduate work in? And I said, I think I'd like to be a librarian. And then he looked at me and said, Carolyn, you'll never find a husband in a library. He was a very loving man.
Sure.
That's how he treated all his
Right.
teachers.
Right.
But I applied to Lily's and to the foundation, and I had to write a long composition. I had to go through a lot of paperwork.
Mhm.
I had to go through an
Interviews?
interview. I had to go to IU for the interview, or Bloomington, you know.
Right.
Anyway, after all that, I got the money for the master's with all the everything covered financially and spending money and everything. And I always felt that maybe because I hung in there those 7 years,
Mhm.
just like you said about the man who his son got more than the man ever thought
Right.
was going to happen.
Exactly.
Now, there were times that I looked back and I thought, Lily's, where were you when I was
going through?
starting?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
but it happened.
And by me sharing that story from my friend, and I don't think he would mind me sharing that. But if that doesn't happen to you, if it doesn't work out like his story did, that doesn't mean God is still not being faithful
No.
to
The
you.
7 years
Yeah.
made me just appreciate my education. And when students would come to me and say, I'd love to go to college, but my family we're poor. And I say, yeah, I know that story. I
Mhm.
feel like I wrote it.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
you can do it.
Right.
You can do it.
Right. So, so he goes on to say again, talking, he's using examples here, circumcision, and now he's moved on to slavery. Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you. But if you get a chance to be free, take it. Verse 22. And remember, if you were a slave when the Lord called you, you are now free in the Lord. I mean, it's like you may never be free of being a slave, but in Christ you are free. And so you are now, and he changes the focus of where this slavery lies now. He said, if you were free when the Lord called you, you are now a slave of Christ. In this whole area of our allegiance is first to him. And can you imagine what kind, if a person who was in that situation was a slave, and they now see that their allegiance and obedience is to Christ, how that also affects their role in the home or wherever they're a slave, how they live that out. To like it could be even better in this, not better for them maybe, but better that the master sees something different by how they're responding and how how they're living out their freedom in Christ. Verse 23, God paid a high price for you, so don't be enslaved by the world. It's a change of focus. Instead of you seeing yourself living by the standards and following the rules of the world as they would dictate it, you follow Christ. And that focus should make a difference in how you live your life. You and I can choose to live like this world and be upset most of the time, and I can't believe that's happening. But this world is, that whole thing, this world is not my home, I'm only passing through. I think that goes as well for the focus that we have as we're living here. Am I going to be, that whole idea, am I going to be pulled down and live the lifestyle such as this world says, or am I going to follow Christ and do it as he says? Does that make sense? Well, one nodded their head, so I'm going to take it at that. So, and then verse 24, each of you, dear brothers and sisters, should remain as you were when God first called you. Now, by him saying that, I don't think he's saying you can't have any upward movement in your life. I don't think he means that you can't have some changes in your life that are good for you. But I think he is addressing, if you're single, stay single. If you're married, stay married. That's the way he anticipates it should do. Okay, verse 25. What time is it?
4 till.
4 minutes.
Okay. Verse 25. it says, now regarding your question about the young women who are not yet married. Within the book of Corinthians, Paul addresses, first of all, things that he has heard in chapters 1 through 6. He's heard these things are happening within the Corinthian church. And so he's addressing those things, about pride, selfishness or whatever. He addresses those things that he's very disappointed in how the church is reacting and how it's living. And now we know that the Corinthians, have sent Paul a letter. And in this letter, there are questions. In fact, there are 6 of them. As we go through the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, we will encounter all 6. Here is the very first one in verse 25. And so apparently the church at Corinth has asked this question regarding the question. Now regarding your question about the young women who are not yet married, they must have sent this question, said, what do we do about, what is their situation? What happens here? And then he says next, I do not have a command from the Lord for them. Okay, now what does that mean?
Lord, what they must do.
Yeah, I don't think what he's saying is, whatever you see, and this is using King James language, thus saith, if he says, if it's that, you have no wiggle room there. If Jesus says it and that's what you should, that's the direction you should be going, but this is what he anticipates you will do. You don't have, I think I understand what he's saying, but I want to do it this way. What he is saying here, this is not a thus saith the Lord. This isn't a direct command that I've gotten from the Lord to tell you about them and their situation. It goes on to say, but the Lord in his mercy has given me wisdom. In other words, he said, this isn't a command or whatever, but he has given me some wisdom as an apostle now, and how I've lived life and what's going on, and so I can come and bring something to the table that probably is going to be helpful for you to pay attention to. But
My version says, I give an opinion.
Okay, he says he gives, okay. I think I could go with that. What version do you have?
Whose is this? Holman, I don't think it says New Translation, but
Okay,
sometimes translations
right.
are maybe versions.
Yeah, I was going to be smart aleck and say, is that even a Bible?
Oh, yeah. Oh, just because it's green.
Yeah, that's
instead of
right.
black.
Yes. But the Lord in his mercy has given me wisdom, opinion, whatever, that can be trusted. It basically says, what I'm about to say, you can trust this. And I think almost saying you need to pay attention here. And I will share it with you. Verse 26, because of the present crisis. Now, what do you think that means?
Well, I hate to keep talking.
Yeah, can somebody else talk?
Well, when we started this study, we talked about how cosmopolitan
Very good word, yeah.
that Corinth was, right, Ben? And he did.
Ben shook his head, yes.
All right.
He says
And
yes.
I think the present crisis or situation might be just that city and everything that goes on in it.
What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth.
Or it never happened.
Or it never happened, yeah. Yeah, there's some differences of opinion about crisis. Some people think, maybe there's maybe persecution going on or something's coming, and Paul is aware of this or feels this or senses it. But if there is this present crisis, maybe you shouldn't be getting married because how much harder it's going to be. Your spouse could be used against you if it comes to just a horrible situation of torture or whatever. And so I've heard it expressed that way, and have expressed it myself. But others say, well, it may be only a temporary thing, and maybe we shouldn't think about it totally in that thought. But because of the present crisis, I think it is best to remain as you are. And then he goes on and gives some examples. If you have a wife, do not seek to end the marriage. Going back to what he said earlier. If you do not have a wife, do not seek to get married. But if you do not get married, it is not a sin. And I think that's important because he says earlier, this is not a direct command from the Lord. This is just my opinion. So he says, my advice is that if you're not married, don't get married. But if you do get married, that's not a sin. That's what he's saying. So it's not that. And if a young woman gets married, it is not a sin. He says, I think you ought to remain single, but she chooses to do so. And he says, that's not a sin. However, it goes on to say, those who get married at this time will have troubles. And I'm trying to spare you those problems. So there is something going on there. And he's just trying to save them heartache by whatever decision they make. But he also gives some more qualifiers even after this. So we'll pick up there, verse 29, and hopefully next week we'll finish it, and we'll probably get into chapter 8. So thank you, and others that join us online. Appreciate having you. And then all of you in here, thank you for coming too and participating. I like that the best, where I don't have to do all the talking. So thank you so much. So Diana, you went away on a trip somewhere, didn't you?
I went to Dale Hollow.
Okay.
Yeah, there was 13 of us girls.
Oh,
On a
some friends of
houseboat.
yours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I've known since childhood.
Yeah.
So we had a great time. But
I've heard families have even our family, we went to my boys and their wives and my grandkids. This was the first time we did it.